Chapter 5. Temple of Torment. Laura put out her hand to find the wall. Its icy cold sent a shiver up her arm. She moved carefully along, feeling her way, trying to make no noise. But her heels clicked terrifyingly loud on the stone. For what seemed endless hours, she stumbled ever up and round in an ascending spiral. In God's name, when would this end? Suddenly she froze to the supporting wall. She pressed against its frosty surface as if she would push herself through the very rock. Nightmare terror encased her in a moveless shroud. Retching nausea heaved at her stomach. Somewhere, far ahead, came a dread, familiar sound. The clank of chains dragging against stone. The manacled maniacs were coming for her. Oh God, she could not stand this any longer. Behind her were the metal creatures, waiting for her in the cave of 1,000 horrors. In front were madmen with brutish faces and gloating, red-lusting eyes. She was trapped. She had no way to turn, to run. The clanking grew louder. The rock magnified the sound, the tunnel air caught it and threw it with unholy glee from wall to wall. Pad went the naked feet. Laura pressed tighter to the rock. A tiny flicker of hope pierced her frenzy. The steady, padding march was that of a single pair of misshapen feet. Perhaps, in the blanketing dark, he would not see her. Perhaps he would pass her by unknowing. She steeled herself for the supreme effort. He was closer now. She could hear the sharp rattle of chains, the banging sound they made as they struck against the rock. Bare feet pressed the stone with a sinister, sucking sound. Low, snuffling whimpers preceded him as he shuffled ceaselessly along, closer and closer. Already she could smell the peculiar fador of the bestial mad, an effluvia that turned her stomach and made her faint with its foulness. Here he was, snuffling and whining like an ailing dog. The noise of his groping approach was overwhelming. Laura bit her lips to keep back the terror that welled within her. She bruised her flesh in a mad attempt to make herself one with the wall. She held her breath until her lungs were suffocating and bright lights danced before her eyes. Oh God, please make him go on. Please make him miss me. He was almost abreast now. His fetid breath was a foul exhalation. Thank God, he was moving ahead. Thank God. Laura gulped in air and froze again. He had stopped. In the pitchy blackness, nothing could be seen. But all sound had ceased, even the whimpering noises in his throat. The silence pressed down on Laura's skull with unbearable weights. He had heard that sudden intake of breath. She dared not move, dared not make the faintest noise. Somewhere in the tar-barrel murk crouched the madman, waiting with perverted cunning for her to betray herself. A hideous game of hide-and-seek in which she was the mouse. Death-like stillness, more terrible than any noise, grew hideously. An enveloping glare of unseen eyes, the stale, rank odor of an animal's den tainted the air. Laura swayed faintly. She fought to hold herself erect, to control the shuddering of her body. A grim, premonitory clank came to her. The maniac was tired of waiting. His chains dragged, and his bare feet made shuffling sound. Along the wall came the slithering noise of a sliding, pressing hand. He was coming back for her. Every nerve shrieked madly for her to run. But he knew this tunnel and she did not. She could never escape. Her only chance was to stay motionless, soundless, hoping. Oh God! Flashes of burning heat and unutterable cold swept over her quivering form. She was suffocating, bursting with an agony of fear. The slobbering of his brutish lips was loud in her ears. Something brushed against her side. A long, choked scream tore from her throat at that contact. She flogged her fainting body away. She tried to run. Too late. A great, hairy arm whipped out, caught her in a grip of steel. A hoarse, avid cackle came out of the darkness. The next instant, her thrashing form was lifted into the air. An overpowering stench enfolded her, and she was being carried swiftly where. How long that dreadful journey took Laura was never able to tell. Mercifully, her mind was misted, unraveled by the very horror of her situation. It was the sudden cessation of movement the murmur of strange voices that roused her from her torpor. Her captor had crouched against the wall, the thick gurgling in his throat had ceased. His filthy fingers dug deep into her form. Feet were moving up the tunnel. A harsh voice raised in anger. The echoes made it hollow, artificial. "You damned fools," it said. "You let her get away. If she finds her way out." "It wasn't our fault, boss," someone else whined placatingly. "It's those suits what did it. A fellow can't even turn properly in one of them their things." "Don't be worryin'," a third coarse voice spoke up. "She ain't got a chance to get out. We'll find her fast enough," and he chuckled, but there was no mirth in that chuckle. "God help you if you don't," growled the one they called the boss. He sounded nervous. They were passing close by now, feet thudding in unison. Laura opened her mouth to scream, to cry out for help. They were at least human beings, perhaps there was mercy in their souls. There could be none in her captor. But the madman sensed her movement. A great paw clamped down on her mouth, stifling the sound in her throat, choking her with vile odors. Then the noise was further up, fainter and fainter, until it blanked out. Not until then did the maniac move. The retching noise in his throat was horribly like a paean of triumph. He moved swiftly again, heedless of clanking ends of chains, as if he knew he had nothing now to fear. Laura gave herself up wholly for lost. The escaped madman was taking her to his secret lair, and then light glimmered ahead. It was yellow and dim, but it grew stronger as they progressed. Laura opened her pain-haunted eyes. The tunnel was widening. Then they were in a great, irregular cavern. Blinding lights flashed into her face, lights that stabbed and burned her body. Once more, she felt as if the bones were rotting within her shriveling flesh. The jagged walls were alive with a million yellow sparkles, just as the smaller cave beneath. The black, gleaming rock was cut and hewn, and mounds of fragments and broken chunks flamed with a wild, unholy luster at regularly spaced intervals. It was a place of evil, of stifling, almost unbreathable atmosphere. Her captor growled like a wolf whose hackles bristled against an unknown enemy. He seemed to sense the frightful burden of this blazing cavern, and hastened his shambling walk almost to a run. The chains clanked dismally behind him. Once more, his paw clamped over Laura's mouth, shutting off all sound. Again the cavern narrowed, became another tunnel. The terrible luminescence was left behind, but another and ruddier radiance cast its flare ahead. Cool, night air flowed with reviving vigor over her pain-racked body, helped mitigate the stupefying effluvia of the beast man who pressed her close to his filth-stiffened shirt. Somehow, she knew that here was the end of the journey, here would come the tremendous denouement to this night of terror and horror. What dreadful scene was she, a captive to a mindless beast, about to witness? He was going slowly, cautiously now. His chains made barely perceptible noise. The tunnel took a bend. A rude, plank door blocked the opening to the outer world, but the planks were rough and so nailed as to leave wide gaps between. The mindless being crouched before a crack. His hairy paw tightened on Laura so that her breath was a choking gasp. The growl in his throat was a low rumble of hate. Fighting for air to fill her lungs, helpless in a grip of iron, Laura nevertheless peered out into the night with him. Before her stretched level rock, the truncated top of Superstition Mountain. The night pressed down with cold, dead stars on the desolate stone. The wind swept in from the sinister emptiness of space. A blood-red fire leaped and mouthed tongues of flame at the whistling blast. Shadowy figures silhouetted blackly against its ruddiness, vanished into encompassing darkness, and reappeared again like disembodied creatures of the void. But it was not this that held Laura's wide, horror-filled gaze, and brought the shrieks gurgling against the broad, restraining paw. It was the smooth, round pit that yawned in the solid rock, almost beneath her very eyes. Flames spilled gory shadows into that dreadful hole, and tossed in a bloody scarlet on the upraised faces that swirled within. Faces loomed there, snarling and bestial, more animal than the ape, more cruel in their mindlessness than the wolf. Foam dripped from their protruding, slobbering lips, howls of rage mingled with gruesome cackling and horrible laughter. Great hairy arms swung threateningly up at the figures who moved restlessly about the fire. The blood-red light glinted on manacled wrists and long, pendant chains. One upthrust, naked arm held a long white bone, horribly like the thigh bone of a human being. The creature who brandished it was chuckling, and as he snarled his eerie laughter, he thrust the gruesome relic into his mouth, and crunched on it with sickening sound. Laura moaned and gagged. Her stomach churned with queasy motion. These were the maniacs who had been driven down the lumber road in chains. These, and others like them. From this pit had her captor somehow twice escaped. From this pit, in which they were manacled and staked like bears for some dreadful sport. Suddenly she twisted with superhuman strength in the madman's arms. She flung free for a moment, and a great shriek of desperation burst from her lips before the smothering hand could grip her down again. She had seen a Euro, in that leaping, twisting, rattling, howling mob of the living Euro, Frank, her husband. His lean face was stubbled with dirt and unshaven beard, his cheeks were hollow with straining madness Euro, and he leaped and danced and howled wilder and louder than all the rest. Frank! She screamed in the last extremity of agony at the sight of him. Instantly, the platform of rock was a swirl of movement. The shadowed figures around the fire leaped toward the sound. The madmen whipped up their clamor to a hideous pitch. Frank, the man who only that morning had kissed her with understanding affection, seemed to hesitate a split second. Then he too went on with his interminable leaping and howling. He had not even turned his head. Laura's captor whipped his great arm about her throat with a bestial snarl. She gasped and tried to struggle, but the cruel pressure cut off all air. Searing pain lanced her neck, blackness enveloped her. Then, suddenly, the pressure relaxed. The maniac whimpered with fear, threw her crashing to the ground, and ran with a huge clangor of chains back the way he had come. "Get the girl," a hollow voice ordered. "Never mind the other. He will keep." She was being lifted, carried out into the open. The cool night air cut across her fainting senses, the rushing wind stung her back to life. She opened her eyes slowly, closed them again with a long, shuddering moan. 3 men stood over her, etched in the flare of the whipping flames. 3 men. 2 she had never seen before, though vaguely she sensed that they had been the monsters of metal in the cave of yellow horror beneath. Now they were clad in white, shapeless pants and semi-sleeve shirts. They grinned at her with evil mockery, and the little worms of lust crawled in their narrowed eyes. One was broad and thick and heavy-set, with the bullet head and brutal look of a battered pugilist. The other was like a swooping vulture, with huge, enormous nose, black, bent brows, and misshapen, flapping ears. But it was the third man who had forced the moan from her pallid lips and thrust icy fingers down her spine. Yet he seemed more kindly Euro, as he was more ancient Euro, than his brutish companions. A black shroud swathed his spare form. A wrinkled, bony mask of white emerged in startling contrast from the midnight robe. The top of his skull was a hairless, gray expanse. White, bushy eyebrows projected incredibly overshadowed eyes. His mouth was thin and bloodless, and his cheeks were of a queer, gray pallor. This was the man with the whip, who had driven his manacled slaves along the road, who had slashed Frank across the back when he had stopped in dumb vacuity before the house where his wife had crouched, shivering with terror. The boss motioned with his head. At once his two companions sprang to Laura, jerked her roughly to her feet. She swayed and could not stand. That bony face before her seemed alive with the wisdom of age, but something in those deep, shadowed eyes sent her heart hammering madly against her ribs. There was more of mercy in those driveling maniacs in the pit than in this tall, spare, benevolent-seeming creature. "What do you want of me?" she gasped. "What have you done to my husband?" The word almost choked her. Frank in that pit of mindless men, dancing and leaping and shrieking. Oh God! For a moment, the boss stared motionlessly at the frightened girl. She tried to face him bravely, but the thought of Frank made her wilt into a human pendulum, swung on the powerful arms of his minions. "Ah, yes, your husband," he said finally. His thin lips writhed into a fleshless smile, but the rest of his face did not move. His voice was like a rumbling echo, deep and hollow. "He will be useful to me. Already he is more a madman than the others." It took very little of the precious serum to blast his reason loose from his mind. "Look at him, my dear, and see how he recognizes you." They swung her around on dragging feet to face the pit. The smooth, funnel-like depression became a bedlam of noise and clamor. The maniacs leaped high against their chains at the sight of her. Raging lust inflamed their bestial countenances, dragged delirious howls from their maddened throats. "And dear God in heaven, let me die now," she prayed. Her husband leaped and yelled with the rest. His eyes glared at her without recognition, and his chains were a frenzy of clangor as they dragged him back from his jumpings. "There you are, my dear," the boss cackled. "He is indeed a prize. I'm sure he'll be the best worker I have." Something snapped within Laura. She tore loose from the restraining arms. She jumped screaming and clawing for the beast who taunted her. "You vile, filthy creature," she shrieked. "You've made animals of men. You've made a living hell for my husband. But you shall die." Her clawing fingers raked for his face. He jumped back with an oath of rage. His lean fingers plucked under his shroud, came out with a short, scimitar-like blade. She hurled herself forward again, ready to transfix herself upon the knife, if only she could reach that devilish countenance. But the two henchmen were upon her. They caught her plunging form by the arms, wrenched backward until they almost tore them out of their sockets. Sobbing, gasping, whimpering, Laura glared with half-mad eyes at the boss. There was unutterable evil about his lips and in the blazing depths of his eyes. He fingered his blade meaningly. For one moment, it seemed as if he would drive it into her loud clamoring heart. Then his eyes flicked past her to the pit, where the madmen were yammering more horribly than ever. His lips curled sinisterly. "That would be the cream of the jest," he said thinly. He thrust back his head and laughed. That bloodless laugh sent chills down Laura's back, shriveled her heart to a small, motionless ball. "Exactly," he nodded with self-satisfaction. "It will be great sport. I should have thought of that before. Now, listen to me, you little she-devil. Listen and faint with very terror. Know what I am doing before you die." The significant pause before that final word, dreadful enough by itself, whipped the madness from her brain, brought in its place crawling maggots of fear. "I have found in the depths of Superstition Mountain rich deposits of radium ore, the richest in the world. It was I who discovered the tunnels and caverns that lead all the way to the top where we now are standing. But the mountain belongs to someone else. He would not sell. So I am mining the ore in spite of him." He laughed horribly. "Radium is terribly dangerous," he continued. "It burns the flesh away, it rots the bones. My men and myself use leaden helmets and lead-impregnated clothes when we descend into the caverns where the pitchblende lode is to be found. But they are clumsy, and it is impossible to work in them. Besides, I needed more hands for the work, and I dared not trust anyone else. So I thought of a scheme. He paused while Laura almost fainted with loathing, with dread of what he was going to say. If I could make men into maniacs, mindless creatures to obey my will, it would serve a double purpose. They would not know the danger and would mine the ore for me. Nor could they betray the secret, if they broke away and escaped. I obtained a certain serum, known only to an ancient Indian medicine man, that was guaranteed to drive men mad if given in doses at definite intervals. It worked. How the beast gloated over his fiendish scheme. Already they have mind enough to make me a millionaire. But I want more. I want to be the richest, most powerful man in the world. And I shall. An insane light glared in his eyes. Another month of toil with this fresh supply of wretches and there will be enough. But the poor creatures you have tortured, Laura burst out. What happens to them? He was unutterably evil now. They die. A month of toil in the mine and they gangrene and rot away, flesh and bones and all, from the radium emanations. It is not a pleasant death. They scream and beg for death to come, but it delays. He thrust his snarling lips close to the panting girl. Your husband will scream louder than the rest. Iron bands compressed around Laura's skull. You damnable fiend, she panted, struggling in the iron grip of the thugs. The boss leered down at her. But you haven't heard the rest of my plan. It concerns you. Kill me, she gasped. Aye euro, donta euro, kari euro, anymore. I shall not kill you, he said slowly, leaning forward to observe the full effect of his dreadful words. Your husband shall kill you euro, he and his lovely mates. I shall throw you into the pit with them.